Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2025, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 30 minutes.
Tonight, we'll talk about one more time what I think is the most pressing problem facing America as we try to address the crime rate, the drug problem, the education problem. And it's a problem that was sadly not addressed in the Big Beautiful Bill. As a matter of fact, the Big Beautiful Bill went to a certain extent the opposite direction. But I want to educate the American public on this problem, and that is the breakdown of the traditional family with a man in the household over the last 60 years of America. And as this Congress tries to make America great again, it is hard to imagine America being that great if we continue to punish and penalize any family that has both parents at home. America has changed dramatically. In the 1960s, about 5% of the children in this country were born into families without both a mother and father at home. And I want to point out, I know families of all sorts of backgrounds. I know parents who've done a fantastic job of raising children in all backgrounds, and sometimes beyond their fault, they're families who appear to be doing a perfect job of raising their children, but nevertheless have a problem. I think most Americans, though, with common sense would say it is more difficult for, say, the post-1995 generations, where 40% of American children were born without a mother and father at home, compared to the generation of children born in the 60s, when that number was only 5%. One has to ask yourselves, why did that happen? And sometimes when I talk to people back home, they mention the decline in religion, and maybe that's why we shot up from 5% to 40%. But actually, if you look at the programs the government authors, and I'm going to reference George Gilder a little bit here, who was a great sociologist, if I can call him that, who wrote Wealth and Poverty in 1980. He looked at families, single-parent families, to see if he had any observations. And the families he looked at were specifically from the poorer parts of Albany, New York. And at the time a woman got pregnant, if the family was not a married group, they began to collect benefits. And it was not a panic situation in which, how are we going to support the child? What are we going to do? Are we going to have to live with your parents? What are we going to do? It was kind of gleeful as they went from government office to government office, getting their low-income housing, getting their free health care, getting their free college education if they wanted to go to college, food stamps, like I said, free apartment, which I think is the most generous giveaway of all. Now, I don't know that it's good that we've created a situation in which a young person getting pregnant should be happy because of all the government benefits they're eligible for. But if you look at the eligibility requirements for every one of these programs, they're based on what we call percent of poverty. And if you have somebody in the household, let's say it could be a woman, could be a man, if a man is in the household, you could penalize that family by easily $25,000 or $30,000 cash for having both parents in a home. Example of programs which fit the bill, which we penalize people for getting married, would be formerly called food stamps, certainly low-income housing, which by itself can be a benefit of over $12,000 a year, something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which can easily be $6,000 or $7,000 a year provided you work and keep your income under $17,000 or $16,000 a year. If you do a little bit of work, unlike, say, if you had a sister who was married to a husband with a salary, you would get free child care not available to a couple with two incomes. There's a TANF program for people who aren't employed, giving free cash away. Again, much easier to get if you don't have a working parent in the household. We have our child credit, which is again something that's phased out and appears designed to discourage people from getting married. We have Pell Grants, and I'll tell you a story about that in a minute, a program which gives free college to a family without a working person. Now, not surprising if you spend some time talking to people who aren't at your country club fundraiser, spend some time talking to people who are not lobbyists, you will be surprised how many young people today are not getting married because they want that $25,000, $30,000 cash benefit that you get if you stay single and frequently don't have a man in the house. I'll also point out that frequently these benefits allow you to get benefits better than people who are on the government are getting. For example, it's a well-worn thing, but if you talk to people, clerks at the local food store, they will tell you that people frequently on food stamps are buying things that the clerk in the food store cannot afford. When it comes to low-income housing, particularly because we have a horrible program called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the government incentivizes developers to build housing that costs $300,000 or $400,000, or in some cases over $1 million per unit, in which some people will be able to live provided their income is low enough. So you'll find out what a person working for me once found out. She got married, and her husband, new husband, were looking for a new apartment, and they found what they felt were the nicest apartments in Madison, Wisconsin, were the low-income apartments, which not only do you get a free apartment, but it's superior to the apartments that other people are paying for. With regard to child care, I've heard a child care provider say that she preferred to get the vouchers, and I don't know if this is always true, I've heard mixed bag, but get vouchers from somebody from the government because those were always paid. Child care is very expensive today. If you agree to take care of a child, maybe sometimes that family will not have enough income to pay for the child. But if you're on the government dole, it's more consistent. You will always get the child care credit. With regard to college, I'll tell you a story. I once gave this speech about 15 years ago in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I wondered what the people would think about the marriage penalty. Most of the people who were listening to the speech were older people. It was a Tea Party group. And they, of course, all agreed to me that it was scandalous that we were bribing somebody $25,000 a year to get married. But I asked a gal who was present in the room that night, her job was a bartendress, what she thought about these programs in which you would get a benefit, not only if you didn't get married, but an even larger benefit if you didn't work too hard. And her attitude was that she had a lot of friends, or that she got married before she had a baby, but a lot of her friends preferred not to get married before they had a baby because they got free college. So in other words, one more time, we had a situation in which this woman, and I've found out other people in the same boat making the same observation, young people going to college, kind of hard to believe, but it's true, may decide not to get married because they get the Pell Grant, another poorly designed program, and get it paid for either all or part of their college. Now, you may say, is this all on purpose? Did the government design these programs to destroy the American family? You'd say, who would do that? But let's not forget that Karl Marx, a socialist who is looked up to in some universities said one of his goals was to abolish the family. More recently, in 1960, a woman who's been described as the mother of women's studies, which are a major we make fun of in college, but nevertheless it's something a lot of kids take as an elective anyway, said, Kate Millay, mother of these classes, the complete destruction of the traditional marriage and the nuclear family is the utopian goal of feminism. I have a feeling a lot of people don't realize that the utopian goal of feminism was to get rid of the nuclear family. But obviously, Kate Millay's successors are probably thrilled that we penalize married couples $25,000, $30,000 for getting married. More recently, a Wisconsin Supreme Court judge, this was just what we call dictum, but nevertheless she was a judge elected statewide, she said the notion that marriage serves as the foundation of the family is at best outdated and worse, misogynistic. Now, this is a woman, she didn't obviously put that on her television commercials, but it's interesting that a very liberal judge in the state of Wisconsin clearly had contempt for traditional marriage. Apparently, maybe took some women's studies classes in college, but it seemed from her comments in this court case that she would be thrilled if the traditional marriage was no longer the norm. I talked to an Indian immigrant back home in my district. He made an interesting observation. And congressmen should go out of the way to talk to their immigrants, because frequently they have observations as what's going on in America that Americans who have been their whole life do not have. What he said is that in America, the woman marries the government. And that's exactly true. But when we have a country in which the woman is encouraged to marry the government, both the woman and the child and the father pay a price. Children born in a difficult background like this are by almost every standard, on average, and I realize there are examples of tremendous parents, on average, have a tougher go of it in life. They're going to struggle more in school. They're going to be more likely to use drugs. They're going to be more likely to commit crimes. It's kind of interesting when I sit in committee hearings around here, and we had a committee hearing on crime earlier this week, and people look around for the causes or this or that of the problems we have, problems related to drug abuse, problems related to crime, maybe problems related to depression, and they never talk about what the real problem is. The real problem being the breakdown of the family. Does anybody doubt that if we still had a rate of fatherlessness in the home, or a rate of intact families back to 5% as we did in the 1960s, that our crime rate would drop like a stone? Does anybody think or not think that the number of, even though it can happen in the best of families, the number of people dying of drug abuse wouldn't fall? Does anybody think our education would improve as we had kids who were doing a better job of focusing at school? It's high time in the second bill that this Congress passes that we begin to address this problem. We can't address it by giving every married couple $25,000 a year, because we don't have that kind of money, and it would probably only encourage more people to not work very hard. And by the way, I should mention, just as these programs discourage marriage, they all discourage work. I'll mention the low-income housing tax credit program. I ran into somebody a couple months ago, and in order to be eligible for these very nice apartments, they could only make so much money. So this person, I'll speculate they were making, say, $50,000 a year. They had to look out, if they got a second job, that their rent would go up. Because in this country, particularly in the low-income housing tax credit, we penalize people who work hard. I think that's a horrible public policy, but that's what we do. So in any event, I strongly hope that when the next reconciliation package comes through, that Republican leadership, rather than allowing something like the low-income housing tax credit to go through, be expanded of all things, Republican leadership recognize this a problem. And even if they don't care if a man is in the house or not, at least they shouldn't penalize. They shouldn't hate families in which a man and a woman are raising the children together. So I think that should be the number one priority of Congress. Now, the second issue that I'm going to take on, we passed a defense authorization bill last week that I think had a serious problem, and I would hope our slumbering press corps would do a little bit more work on the problem. You know, we had Elon Musk and Doge around here, and they did a good job of pointing out that there were some, particularly in offices, some federal employees in the District of Columbia area and around the country that maybe weren't working that hard. And sometimes that happens in the private sector, more likely it's going to happen in the public sector. We right now have about 80,000 employees, I think a little bit under that, maybe 760, employees in the Department of Defense who are not uniformed. I assume most of these employees, it's not people who cut the lawn or something, most of these employees are in an office, and at least Elon Musk seemed to point out that a lot of them may not be working that hard. Under the defense authorization, they anticipate over the next year the number of non-uniformed employees drop by maybe another 30 or 40,000. I think when Doge was riding high, I think one would have expected this number to drop more like 200,000 or 300,000. I have then asked the Department of Defense to, as quickly as possible, put together a proposal and say what would happen if you had to make do with only 400,000 or 450,000 non-uniformed employees in the Department of Defense. And I'll point out a lot of these employees are making over $150,000 a year with anecdotal evidence they do very little. You know, one of the reasons Congress is so irresponsible is our press corps is asleep. But I hope our press corps digs into this situation a little bit, publicize how many people we have working in desk jobs in the Pentagon, desk jobs in which they are not in uniform, and questions whether this is really necessary, and we can see whether there are significant savings here. Some of the money, of course, will not just go to reducing our debt, but insofar as we find excess people around here, I think we are not prepared enough in this country for hypersonic missiles. I don't think we have an Iron Dome type Israel situation in which we are prepared for other sorts of missiles. And the reason we're not prepared is I think we have way too many people working not as hard as they could in the Pentagon. So I'm going to ask the press corps to wake up and ask people about that, just as I'm asking the press corps to wake up and ask congressmen whether it's appropriate that we penalize married couples by $25,000 or $35,000 a year because they got married, as opposed to their siblings who may not have gotten married. There's one other thing I want to comment on tonight. And I was listening to a television program on one of the big conservative networks and listened to a commentator make fun of socialism and talk how much better capitalism was. But I don't think she had a good handle on why capitalism is good. First of all, we ought to require all defenders of capitalism to not call capitalism capitalism. We ought to call it a free market economy. And the reason we would so much rather live in a country with a free market economy than in a country that is a socialist economy. The major reason is the government has so wildly much more power in a socialist country than a free market economy. In a socialist economy, or as we work more towards a socialist economy, a larger and larger segment of the population works for the government. I have noticed in my time as an elected official that frequently people who work for the government are afraid to speak openly to me about problems in their field. Maybe I'm thinking like a substitute teacher would be afraid to give me a campaign contribution because they worked for a school district that was hostile to Republicans, and they felt they would be discriminated against if they knew they gave money to a Republican politician. I've had people who work for the Department of Natural Resources in Wisconsin, which is the equivalent of the EPA in Washington, telling me problems in their department, but cautioning me that they could never cite them. What they were telling me had to be secret because they worked for the government and they were afraid the government would discriminate against somebody who backed the party, the less government party, the Republican Party. In a free market economy, you can rent from whoever you want, right? In a socialist state, all the property is owned by the government. Right now, my office is in a place called Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. If I want to live in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, first of all, I may rent. I'm guessing in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, there are maybe 400 different landlords, and the landlords compete for a rental dollar. I have the ability to buy my own house and paint my house whatever color I want, and maintain my lawn in whatever fashion I want. That's something you can do in a free market economy. In a socialist economy, the government runs everything. If I want to rent a dwelling, I have to rent from the government. And if the government doesn't like me, if I've said the wrong things, if I've said something that's politically incorrect, they may say, we're not going to rent to you, or we're going to give you an inferior place. Same thing comes with food. In a free market economy, my guess in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, a city of only about 35,000 people, I bet there are 150 places where I can go and eat and have something made for me. In a socialist economy, something that the gentleman who's running for mayor of New York would like, I guess he'd want only one type of grocery store, but you'd only have one sort of restaurant because all the restaurants are run by the government. So first of all, they don't have to compete and do a better job because since they're owned by the government, they're never going to go through bankruptcy. But secondly, because they're owned by the government determines what fare are offered, how many restaurants we have that'll serve Italian fare or Mexican or what have you. Much better in a free economy. Even more importantly, in a socialist economy, you have to work for the government. And the more people who have to work for the government, the less freedom they have. If you have to work for the government and the government is all powerful as it is in a socialist state, the government determines whether or not you get to keep your job, whether or not you get to be promoted in your job, whether or not you get a raise, all determined by a government who may look down on you if you are critical of the central planning authority. That's a big difference between a free market economy and a socialist economy. Another difference is, in a socialist economy, you do not have to do well because you're owned by the government. If you have a restaurant that has crummy food, or you have a factory in which the people are not working very hard, as apparently some people are not working very hard for the Department of Defense, you do not get in trouble for that, okay? Because it is a socialist economy, everybody becomes poorer because there is no incentive to work that much harder. You can't lose your job because everybody's working for the government. Another reason why life is so much better in a free market economy. And I think people like being free better. When you talk about testimonials in the old Soviet Union, and probably to this day because the work ethic hasn't changed enough, you run into a lot of very unhappy people because they are stuck in a economic system in which they have to work for the government. As a matter of fact, I know a friend who went to Cuba, and it was an interesting observation. In Cuba, which is an island country, he noticed that there were none or almost no boats on the docks as you went around the Gulf of Mexico. This is a sign of what happens in a socialist state. People are so unhappy there that they won't allow them to get on boats and go into the Gulf of Mexico to somewhere else. They've got to force the people to stay at home. In any event, I think in the future when we explain to the younger people on why we like a free market economy rather than a socialist economy, we should emphasize the freedom that comes with a free market economy, the freedom to pick one of hundreds of employers in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, or if you want to get around the whole country, one of hundreds of thousand employers. The ability to rent or buy a home wherever you want, not where you're restricted where the government is. The ability, when you go to a retail outlet, to have people competing for your sales dollar. So there are a lot of opportunities to buy this clothes or these appliances or whatnot, as opposed to in a socialist state where the government determines what the government bureaucrats think you need. And finally, of course, they are overwhelmingly wealthier because in a free market economy, you are free to work hard, you are free to open up your own business, and by doing that, all of society is wealthier, as opposed to a socialist state in which everybody has to work for the government. There's no guaranteed incentive for working harder. If you think of a better way to do business, you're not allowed to set up business on your own. All you can do is make the suggestion to your boss, and if he doesn't care to take your suggestion how the business can improve, well, it just never improves, which is why the socialist state in old Russia, old Soviet Union, was so ineffective. So in any event, to summarize tonight, first of all, I really hope Republican leadership and President Trump begin to address the $25,000 penalty this country imposes on any married couple with children. Secondly, I hope Republicans point out when they talk about the difference between socialism and what they refer to as capitalism, that the major difference is the freedom that comes from a free market economy. And finally, I hope the press corps pays attention to the huge number of non-uniformed employees in the Department of Defense and what the current administration is doing about it. Thank you very much.
Does the gentleman have a motion?